WRI is on a quest. We're on a journey searching how to figure out how to achieve rapid systemic change at a global scale. And I want to share that journey with you. I'm going to tell you where we came from, where we are, and I'm going to give you a sneak peek at where we think we're going. Last week in this room, we had a week-long gathering of our global leadership team. Most of the team comes from outside the United States. And we worked hard on trying to develop our narrative, think about how we talk about our work, and I'm going to ask you all to be guinea pigs for that. I'm going to share that with you. I'm also going to share some work that I've been leading around the idea of systematic engagement and having people who do what I think Aaron does, systematically identify people with power and influence and develop relationships with them. It's related to communications work, but it's different. And increasingly, we think that that's critical to achieving change at scale. As I do that, it's a little self-indulgent. I'm going to talk all about WRI. I'm going to indulge my role as host. I want you to be thinking about two things. One is we all think of ourselves as think and do tanks. We wouldn't be in think tanks if we weren't trying to change the world. WRI is a big think tank. But I think you'll hear some resonances, even if you're at a smaller tank, with how you think about changing the world. And when I'm through talking, I'll be asking to see, were there resonances or maybe some differences? How do you go about changing the world? The other thing is suggestions and advice for me in how I go about telling this story. So if you could think about those two things as I talk, that would be helpful. I'm going to give you a minute to read that. This is the footer on everybody's email, WRI. It's not actually our mission statement. It's a slightly updated version of the mission statement. And it has roots in the founding of the organization. This is Gus Speth, our founder. Before he founded WRI, he created an organization some of you may belong to called the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC. He believed the Earth needed a good lawyer, and then he believed that the Earth needed good policies. He wanted, when he was in government, he was the head of the Council of Environmental Quality in the Carter administration, and he said, I need people who will bring tested ideas to me, policy ideas to me. When he came out of the Carter administration, he founded WRI. And he said, we're not an activist environmental group, but a research center strongly grounded in science, economics, and practical affairs, yet we are committed to engagement in the policy debate. So that's where we come from. We sit at the nexus between environment and development. A lot of people say we're an environmental think tank. We're also a development think tank. We're very focused on trying to improve the lives of the 2 billion people who scrape by on less than $2 a day, and in general, promoting economic development around the world. And we're also at the intersection between ideas and action. These are our values. Every organization has a list of values. We put our urgency at the top of our list for reasons that you're going to hear about more in a minute. And we have an approach. This really has been our approach for a long time, but it was only in the last 5 years that some people, I've been at WRI for 5 years, they codified this before I got here, count it, change it, scale it. This is how we try and describe what we do to the world. We start with data, analysis, research. We then propose solutions. We work with local communities to implement those. One of the things I was struck, Cecilia, in your talk, and many people around the table, is this focus on policy. When I was at the Center for Global Development, it was really all about policy. At WRI, we're concerned about policy, but we also often start with subnational governmental organizations, but also with companies and with communities. And so try and create an ecology of change. If we're lucky, it'll lead to policy, but sometimes it takes a long time to get to policy. Change it at the local level, and then finally use partnerships to try and leverage that. And a lot of my talk is going to be about new work that we're doing in creating large global partnerships to accelerate change. There is some good news. Last year, 25 million people lifted themselves out of poverty. And since 1990, we've seen the number of people in extreme poverty, which was about 3.5, 4 out of 10, is now only about 1 out of 10. So there's been very rapid progress in poverty reduction. But the world, even though we're going faster all the time, we're falling behind because the problems are getting bigger, faster. The rate of progress is simply not enough. This is a scatter chart. I'll blow it up in a minute. This is a poll of the Davos men and women, people who go to the World Economic Forum, in terms of what they see as the biggest risks. They do this every year. Likelihood is out this way, and impact and severity is on the vertical one. This cluster of stuff this is the really bad stuff that they think is likely to happen. And you see that most of them are related to climate and environmental issues. So we've got extreme weather events, failure of climate change mitigation adaptation, natural disasters, water crises, biodiversity loss, man-made environmental disasters. I would say even some of these that are not circled on this slide, large-scale involuntary migration, likely climate-related in many instances, and interstate conflict. And we're headed the wrong direction in terms of emissions. Climate change is driven by cumulative emissions. Those obviously are going to continue to rise. But even annual emissions are going up. And last year in the United States, emissions rose by the biggest increase since 2010. So we have a big crisis. Last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released this report, 1.5 degrees centigrade report. How many of you noticed when that came out? How many of you paid attention? That's good. Thank you for paying attention. One of the big lessons for that report, you may remember in the Paris Climate Accord, that countries committed to hold climate change to 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. We've already had one. The new science that came out in that report showed that there's a big, big difference between 1.5 and 2. And these are some of them in terms of extreme heat, ice-free Arctic and coral reefs. Basically, what this is telling us is that the tipping point, the point of no return, is probably much, much closer than we think. And that's because of something that scientists call positive feedback loops, but I like to call vicious cycles, which is, and you've all heard these things, when the ice melts at the Arctic, then the blue water absorbs more heat than the white ice used to, and so you get heating that's happening in these vicious cycles. So we have a big challenge, and I'm going to go through these quickly. You read the news as well as I do. You know that we're getting bigger and stronger storms, much hotter weather, big heat waves, fiercer fires, longer droughts, rising seas. I think of these as the 6 horses of the apocalypse, and that poor people are going to be hit the hardest. So the progress that we have seen in poverty reduction over the last 2 or 3 decades could easily be eroded by these things. So what do we need to do? We need to rapidly bend the curve. We need societies and economies and businesses and households and everybody else to rapidly reduce emissions. Previously, we thought keeping warming between 2 degrees was going to be enough. So that would mean this is getting to net zero emissions. So whatever carbon we're putting into the atmosphere is being sucked down in some fashion. We thought we needed to get there around 2065. We now know that we need to get to net zero in 2050. And we're headed in exactly the wrong direction to do that. So to meet this challenge, WRI is growing. I'm going to start with the growth statistics. I wanted to ground the fact that we're growing and the fact that we're responding to bigger challenges. And then I'm going to tell you the more interesting part, which is how we're going about doing this. Our budget has been going up. We derive most of our funding from European governments, from foundations, and from corporations. We are also globalizing. The bottom part here is international staff, and the top is US staff. We're just about at the tipping point now where half of our staff are situated outside the United States, and our goal is to have 2/3 of the staff outside of the United States. So we are growing rapidly in the developing world where most of the decisions will be made that will determine whether or not we can address the climate challenge. I was tempted to not include this. It's a little boring, but since all of you are think tankers and some of you are in think tank management, I thought I would just give you a snapshot of how we are organized. We work on 7 global challenges that are closely interconnected: cities, climate, energy, food, forest, water, and the ocean. We call these our programs. We have 4 centers of excellence that are providing cross-cut support into those programs for business, the relationship with corporations, economics, finance, and governance. And then we have our international offices in Africa. We've got a regional hub in Addis Ababa for Africa, Brazil, China, Europe, India, Indonesia, and Mexico. and then the core functions across the bottom, one of which is communications. So that's sort of a snapshot of us and how we work. This is the global leadership team. That picture was taken here last Thursday at the end of our retreat, and we came together to do annual planning and think about how we can accelerate our efforts and become more effective at achieving rapid systemic change at scale. And one of the things we talked about is the narrative. When I was at Center for Global Development and at the World Bank, there was not a lot of discussion about narrative. Here at WRI, we're always talking about our narrative. We're never happy with our narrative. This is the latest narrative put together by my boss, Andrew Steer, the CEO. And I want to take a moment with this because this is the part that I would like your feedback on later. And there's 6 parts. I'm going to ask for volunteers to read a sentence. Who'd read the first sentence? Could you, Luca?
Yeah, of course.
Use your mic.
Okay. This one?
Yeah.
Okay, narrative 1. There's a better way. Conventional approaches are polluting, inequitable, wasteful, and undermine future prosperity. We have a crisis.
Great. Aaron, would you read the second one, please? Give you a moment to get a mic there.
The scale of the transition requires system-wide transformation in energy, cities, transportation, food, manufacturing, finance, and consumption.
Who else would be willing to help me out here and read? David Hobbs.
In all of these arenas, transformation is possible and can lead to more jobs, stronger economies, healthier and happier citizens. We have examples of success.
Who else will help me out here and read? Yes, please. Remind me your name, I'm sorry. Amy. Thank you, Amy.
Transformation requires smart policies, brave leadership, unconventional coalitions. It also requires tackling barriers to the transition, including ensuring a just transition for those negatively affected and tackling vested interests.
So we workshopped these a little bit. My recollection is that when Andrew shared these with the leadership team, he used the word just transition, which resonates for me. And I was a little surprised to hear him say that because I'm very interested in this book you all have been talking about, Winner Take All. We're all about win-win solutions here, and therefore we don't like to talk about just transitions because some of our funders might find that threatening. So he used the word just transitions, but I don't think he said tackling vested interests. We tend not to talk about that. So I think somebody probably raised their hand and said, yeah, we really need to deal with vested interests. So this is a work in progress. We're wordsmithing that. Who else would be willing to read something? Javier? Did I get your name right?
Xavier.
Xavier. Can you see it?
Yeah, there are great signs of hope, but progress is too slow, and the window of opportunity to get it right is closing.
Okay, and the last one, squeezing into the bottom of the slide there. Who will read that for me? Yes, please.
WRI is helping to deliver this change by...
Yeah, and so this is a challenge from our president and CEO that each person would then be able to cite chapter and verse in terms of what we were doing with data, with statistics, of why change is possible. As I was talking about the climate threat, I could see despair in some people's face. It's very, very frightening. And if we're going to respond to this, we have to believe that the solutions are out there. And the technology is clearly there. The understanding of the science is there. The problem is the politics is difficult. Path dependency is a big problem. But it's actually possible to deal with these problems, and people need to have hope in order to do that. So one example of the drill down narrative, we did some work done just before I joined WRI called the New Climate Economy. And around the time we started that work, there was still an idea climate action will cost money and kill jobs. And there are still people in this country who insist on that view, but that's largely not the view anymore. About 5 years ago, the view was climate action will have only minor negative effects on the economy. So you could do it, but you're going to pay something now for a benefit for future generations. Now the view is economic health can only be sustained if we act boldly on climate. That's increasingly what corporate leaders are saying. It's what mayors are saying. It's what governors are saying. It's what international leaders are saying. And that has come about because of research showing that good climate policy drives gains in efficiency. It can induce new technologies. It provides predictability to investors. So it is win-win. It actually makes sense. But still, we have to overcome the vested interests blocking it. Combined, these can lead to more competitive, more jobs, and healthier citizens. I'm going to show you, I said I'd show you some work in progress. This is like the ugliest chart ever. Is Bill here? Oops, Bill's here. Bill Dugan. I was hoping Bill wouldn't be here, my creative director. He's going to hate this chart. But it's a work in progress. So we start with the research analysis and tools. This is our fort. This is WRI's fort. I actually cleaned this up compared to the one Andrew did, Bill. We have on-the-ground projects through our international offices in developing countries, whether it's landscape restoration, whether it's safe streets, electrifying transportation, building efficiency, renewable energy. We work with communities and corporations in these on-the-ground projects. We also have national level dialogue, and we have global processes trying to induce movements and tipping points. So things like participation in the climate conference, in the UN Secretary General's climate summit in September. And together we hope that all of those will add up to impact. So we work internationally across these three levels. Coming to the end of the talk, and I want to share with you an innovation that has really gathered strength in the last 2 or 3 years and is now baked into our strategy, is what we call delivery platforms. It's a little bit of an awkward term. We struggled with this term. At one point we called them special initiatives, but the idea is that these are large-scale, multi-stakeholder, multi-year initiatives. Many of them are multi-million dollars, pursuing ambitious goals that will significantly advance our mission. They usually have their own brands. In fact, they always have their own brands, and they often share governance and management with external partners. We now have about a dozen of these, and we recently took some space on the 6th floor to house the secretariats for them. In some cases, we describe ourselves as the managing partner. In some cases, we're the host of the secretariat. But we usually have anywhere from 8 to a dozen to 20 people running these initiatives across the global network. We recently inherited one from the WEF, World Economic Forum in Davos, on accelerating the circular economy. That one is based in our office in The Hague. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of these. I mentioned the New Climate Economy, which did the research with partner organizations all around the world on how we could have climate action and economic growth. The NDCs, some of you in climate world may know that these are the nationally determined contributions, the pledges that countries made in Paris. We host something called the NDC Partnership, which is providing a knowledge clearinghouse and a financial clearinghouse to help countries to implement those pledges and to make them more ambitious because the pledges are insufficient to deal with the problem. For the Global Commission on Economy and Climate, we have a group of commissioners. You'll know some of these people: Felipe Calderon, former president of Mexico; Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, former minister of finance in Nigeria; Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever; Nick Stern, who wrote the Stern Report. These people were brought in place before we began the research to serve as advocates and spokespeople, and then they guided the research. So oftentimes we have commissions or high-level panels that are recruited, specifically asked to oversee and guide the work and then become advocates for it. I won't go into these. The Partnering for Green Growth and Global Goals is a public-private partnership initiative, and the Global Commission on Adaptation, which works a little bit like the New Climate Economy, to lift up the fact that climate impacts are on us right now. A lot of the climate debate has been about how do we reduce emissions. We actually need to begin thinking about how our society is going to cope with the impacts that are already hitting us. I'm just going to take last 2 or 3 slides to show you one of these initiatives. This is a global initiative for restoration. And I wanted to, sometimes people forget that we're a think tank. This is the research we did on restoration. This is a restoration diagnostic. How do you do restoration? How do you identify lands that can be restored? This one actually came out in 2011. The economic case for restoration, a new version of the restoration diagnostics, the business of planting trees, how people can make money during restoration, and then the business of planting trees in Africa. So we did the research, but where some organizations might do the research and then be done, we have organized two groups to do restoration internationally. So we elicited pledges from a group called 20 by 20, which aims to restore 20 million hectares under restoration in Latin America by 2020, and a similar kind of initiative in Africa. We know that restoration works. For example, we've seen here in restoring degraded landscapes in Nigeria. I won't go through the costs and benefits. They're substantial. We've seen it in Korea. We've seen it in the Los Plateau in China. This can actually work well. It needs some long-term patient capital, which can be mobilized, but you need a global movement in order to do that. Finally, in the last minute, I want to talk about engagement. I looked around recently and I realized there were a few dozen people in WRI specifically doing the kind of work that Aaron does of systematically identifying influencers and decision makers. And so we ran a little analysis of their titles, and this is the word cloud, and it turned out that engagement really is a thing, at least in WRI. It's connected to communications and connected to a variety of other things. These are some of the folks who do this work. They weren't previously connected to each other. We don't have any we don't have any career path for them. So we've created a community of practice to say this really is an important part of what you do. That's it. These are the WRI watchwords. Lifting up out of my presentation, count it, change it, scale it, sort of baked into our DNA of our values: urgency, urgency, urgency. The others are important: integrity, rigor, but urgency is really, if we can't achieve change at scale, that's the other watchword: scale, scale, scale. We've got to go to a global scale. And then narrative, the storytelling around that becomes a very important piece of what we do. Partnerships, and then quite a new idea for us. We've been doing systematic engagement, but we haven't thought of it as a discipline. And so we're trying to lift that up and make it into a discipline. So thank you for indulging me in telling WRI's story. I'm happy to take any questions.